After the death of George Floyd in police custody in Minneapolis, activists across the U.S. took to the streets to demand police reform.
I know you are reeling. The patchwork of police agencies that patrol D.C. are now out in pretty significant force.
Local and state police and 4,000 members of the National Guard took a stand.
There's a repeated pattern of officers killing unarmed African-American civilians and people protesting, and oftentimes that being ignored.
Too often, some of that violence has come from folks who were supposed to be serving and protecting.
Nobody is more opposed to the small number of bad police officers, and you have them. They're very tiny. I use the word tiny. It's a very small percentage.
There's been calls to defund the police, ban chokeholds, and to more effectively punish officers who abuse their power or show racial bias. But before any proposed policing reforms can actually go into effect, lawmakers and department chiefs would first have to get past police unions. Over the course of decades, police unions have fought to secure generous benefits for rank-and-file officers and helped make the dangerous job of police work more attractive to hundreds of thousands of officers. But when their members come under scrutiny for police brutality and heavy-handed tactics, it's the union that often serves as their first line of defense.
People have perpetuated a false narrative and anti-police rhetoric, but everybody needs to remember police officers are here to help.
Police unions are not above the law in the same way police are not above the law. There's no exception to the rule here that should be applicable for police union leadership.
A police union represents the officers of a given department and negotiates employment contracts specific with the city or town that funds the department. The union also represents officers in labor disputes such as wrongful termination complaints or discrimination accusations.
How do those collective agreements lead to changes in behavior?
Most of the problems that we have when it comes to police violence could be changed if we were able to find ways to eliminate the deals that police unions have implemented to protect police officers from accountability.
Police unions are different than other unions because police work carries the possibility of violence during the normal course of duties. This means that protections negotiated into police contracts can end up shielding officers from complaints that involve violent incidents.
If we want to protect the safety of the products that are made in the U.S., we don't allow an organization that represents the people who make those products to be in charge of setting the standards and enforcing them and implementing accountability and discipline. And that's what we've done with these police unions in many instances.
It looks like collective agreements are being used to protect the ability of officers to discriminate in their use of force.
Police unions say that protections they advocate for help prevent police from refraining to act due to concerns over legal liability, and they also prevent frivolous lawsuits and maintain hiring rates and attract good candidates.
I'm hopeful that we can come to an agreement on some common sense reforms, including a de-escalation standard and training that is nationwide. A lot of cities already do this.
My main advice actually is to employers, is to local governments. Right? When you sit down at the bargaining table, you should be putting public safety first, right? So their priority shouldn't be, for example, minimizing the wage bill. It should be making sure that civilians are safe.
I like the concept of more training. The House does it, we do it. I like the fact that we're looking for a way to ban chokeholds. We do it by taking money from different departments. They do it in a different fashion, but we're about 90% there.
More than 12,000 local police departments were operating in the United States during 2016.
Policing is a state and local issue, and oftentimes it boils down to what's in the contract, and there can be any number of provisions in there that will impede the department's ability to enforce accountability and discipline.
Police unions have the same rights and obligations as other unions. Their history is really, really different, though. The initial police unions in the U.S. were founded during the First World War. Not an easy time to form a union. So what happened after the war? The U.S. government kind of forced those unions out. And then they didn't organize for a long time. But what actually triggered the creation of most police unions in the U.S., the ACLU launched a campaign in the 60s to introduce what are called civilian review boards, right? So to have oversight of policing by regular people. And that actually is what triggered police officers to start forming unions to prevent that civilian oversight of policing.
Police unions are public sector unions, similar to unions around the country for public school teachers, firefighters, and sanitation workers. The Fraternal Order of Police, for example, claims to represent more than 330,000 police officers across the U.S. Police unions are an outlier in one major way.
It's very unique for any union to bargain for an exception that allows them to be above the law.
Connecticut state law actually has a provision that allows a union contract to supersede the state law. And there are some instances where that can even happen when the federal government does step into problematic police departments when there have been civil rights violations. Oftentimes provisions could supersede what's been done on the federal level.
House Republicans will be putting forward a reform legislation proposal.
Let's talk about ending injustice, racial injustice in our law enforcement.
Collective bargaining rights are just that. They're bargaining rights. Police officers work like you and I, and they should have access to that representation if they choose to have it. So when we have reform, it's a two-sided street.
Across the U.S., there are local police, state police, federal police, and county sheriff's departments. This adds to the complication of providing clear guidelines on officer conduct and use of force.
I support unions as a rule, but we don't let everybody form a union in this country, particularly if there are bad acts being done with that power of unionization, like protecting people from accountability for acts of violence.
As demonstrations over police brutality intensified following Floyd's death, police departments across the country drew more criticism for heavy-handed crowd control tactics, such as using tear gas, pepper spray, rubber bullets, and physical force. Police unions have been vocal on social media and at press conferences defending themselves and their actions that are being protested nationwide.
There's been a message not only from our city hall, but from the State House that says there will be a soft touch. And the criminals know it. And while folks were protesting, they were breaking down doors, climbing in windows, pulling out their weapons they're not afraid to carry.
There are no other unions that seek to shield their members from the law in a basic fundamental way, or seek to allow their members to lie to their bosses or lie to others in public on a consistent basis about when they've killed people. That it's not acceptable to engage in that type of behavior, and that should be outlawed. The ability to bargain to be above the law should be outlawed.
I'd just like to point to one city, Camden, New Jersey, who has seen a turnaround in its police force and also in the level of safety in the city. And what they did is took a comprehensive look at this. And part of that included basically getting out of the union and out of the union contract and rehiring those workers as county employees. And they were able to transform their police force. And the changes that they put in place resulted in a 2/3 reduction in homicides rate and a 95% reduction in the number of complaints against officers.
Because of the decentralized nature of police departments in the US, broad, overreaching federal actions are unlikely to have a near-term impact on the ability of police unions to defend bad actors within police departments from being disciplined or terminated by their departments.
Police unions have been one of the last bastions of direct racial animosity in American society. If you look at some of the statements made by police unions in the aftermath of these killings, a lot of them are incredulous, telling you not to believe your lying eyes based on what you saw in the video. And a lot of them have been very blatantly making very derogatory statements about the African American community.
I think a lot of the biggest changes, though, are up to local governments and up to state governments, because now we have a lot of the worst elements of collective agreements have been put into state law in what are called law enforcement officer bills of rights. They'll, for example, make it such that an officer needs to agree to the timing and the location of their investigation or interrogation after killing a civilian.
The long-term effects of recent unrest could affect local and state elections, which could move to curtail the power of police unions in certain towns and cities.
Police unions make the argument that they are exceptionally deserving of this treatment because they are heroes who put themselves in harm's way for our safety. These are not the only public sector workers who put themselves in the way of direct physical harm for our benefit. It's just really the argument does not square up with reality.